And I've got 10 things that I want to talk to you about in terms of wind and solar energy leases. Now, this is a lot different from the oil and gas lease. There are some similarities, but wind and solar are electrical leases. The electrical utility industry works a lot differently from the oil and gas industry. There are different margins involved. There are different royalty calculations. Everything's just a little different. And even in between wind and solar leases, there are some differences as well. So we're going to talk to you about those, and where there are differences, we'll try to point those out to you. The first thing I want you to think about when you're approached for a wind or solar lease is, how is this going to affect my use of the surface? And the answer is a lot different between wind and solar projects. Wind projects might seem to take up a lot of space. They, for example, the strings of turbines might go on for miles. And in terms of overall leased acreage, yeah, wind energy projects lease a lot of acres, but they actually occupy a very small amount of that. Research we did here at OSU showed that for about every megawatt of wind capacity that a project has, it probably physically occupies about 0.87 acres, less than an acre for every megawatt of capacity, and that's including the turbine pads, the roads, the substations, all of that stuff taken together. So they may be really spread out, but wind energy projects actually occupy very little real estate. Now, on the flip side of that, solar projects are much smaller in terms of the leased acres. Lots of Oklahoma's projects are between 5-10 acres. Some of the bigger projects are closer to 20 acres. But they occupy a much greater proportion of that acreage than a wind project does. Wind projects, often occupy about 1%, like 1% of the total leased acreage. Solar projects occupy closer to 40 or 50% of the acreage that's leased. So the land use in solar is a much more intensive use with a smaller overall acreage leased. Wind energy projects, much more expansive, but occupy a much smaller proportion of the acreage that's leased. With wind, usually the leases are very explicit in allowing cropping operations, grazing operations, things of that sort to occur on the leased land. Solar projects often will prohibit any agricultural use of the property. There is one little exception to that. Certain types of solar projects will allow the use of goats or sheep to graze around the panels, because that's about the only animal that will fit underneath them without bumping the equipment. So if you have sheep or goats, you might ask, well, can I graze them in the area of the solar project and not cause any problems? With wind or solar leases, they might be fairly long. Most of the wind leases that we've seen in Oklahoma last for about 50 years. They might last for an initial term of about 30 years with some 10-year renewal periods after that, or variations around that theme. Solar leases, the one or two solar leases that we've got to see in the state, have lasted for 20 to 30 years. And the reason these leases are so long is because there's a lot of fixed cost involved in the project. So the company is saying, we want to extract as much of that fixed cost as we can out of the project, and a longer lease allows us to do that. So just understand, those leases are going to take that land and hold it for that kind of use for a fairly long period of time, and you need to make sure that you're comfortable with that. You need to understand how lease renewals are made part of that lease. Like I said earlier, you might look at a lease and say, oh, it's got a 30-year term, and think, well, this lease is going to be 30 years. But if you read further, you see, and the developer has the option of, for example, 2 10-year renewals. Well, then it's not a 30-year lease. You have to think of it as a 50-year lease. Always make sure you take into account those renewals, because functionally, if they're developer-only options, that's going to extend the term of your lease, and you really won't have an opportunity to say much about that. If your lease might cause any change in the taxes for your property or your insurance premiums, consider that too, and make sure you have provisions that will compensate you if there is an increase in your premium or an increase in your property taxes. And in all of our research that we've done in Oklahoma, we haven't seen, for example, any wind energy projects where the assessor increased the value of the underlying land in response to the project. We have actually, and I mean this very literally, pulled the ad valorem tax records for every single wind turbine in the state, and all of the assessors have regarded those turbines as being personal property and taxed those to the developer, not to the landowner. And to the extent that we've talked to all those assessors, none of those assessors have taken the cash flows and capitalized them into the land cost to increase the assessed value. Now that may change in time, but at least as of our research right now, that hasn't been the case. But it's important to have a provision in there that says, if that does change, we'll have some sort of compensation so it's not costing us more to own the property just because the solar or wind project is there. Excuse me. When you're calculating your royalty payments, understand how those payments are going to be made. And especially for wind projects, there might be multiple layers of royalty payments. You might, for example, get a capacity-based minimum royalty. That minimum royalty might say, for example, the developer will pay you $5,000 per year per turbine located on your property as a minimum. And then we'll calculate the royalty amount, and if the royalty amount is greater than the minimum, we'll pay you the difference at the end of the year. Solar projects tend to be based more just on capacity. I've not yet seen any Oklahoma solar leases that were a royalty basis, but that's not to say that those leases are not out there. They very well might take that form in the not so distant future. But what I want you to do whenever you're presented with a lease is very clearly understand the basis on which your payments are going to be calculated. And like we talked about earlier, make sure you have some means of verifying the accuracy of those payment calculations. If you're paid on a royalty basis, the royalty is not necessarily a royalty in the same way that an oil and gas lease is, but most often it's going to be defined by some percentage of the gross revenue generated from the sale of power that was generated on your property. Wind leases almost universally start out at a 4% royalty. In other words, you would get 4% of the gross revenues from power generated on your property. You also need a means of understanding how much power was generated from your property, and that can vary from lease to lease as well. We haven't seen enough solar leases in Oklahoma to get a good feel for what that market number is. It tends to be a little bit lower, though, in the leases that we've seen, and that's because solar power is a little more expensive to generate in terms of the equipment than wind power. Those numbers, I think, are going to come down over time. They may equal, and solar might even drop to be a little bit below what wind is, but for right now, the royalty numbers that we have seen where that is a royalty, and again, with most solar operations, it's not a royalty, it's just a fixed per capacity payment. So in other words, if we're going to install 5 megawatts of capacity on your land, we're going to pay this fixed amount. In other solar leases I've seen, by the way, it's just a flat annual payment. It's not based on capacity, it's basically just a lease of the land where the solar panels are located. So understand how that payment is going to work. Make sure you can verify that. Make sure you can audit those payments. Know what triggers your payments. For example, you might have a payment that is due upon starting construction of the payment. Starting construction of the project. In which case, you should need to know, what does that mean? Does that mean when you flag the layout? Does that mean when you start moving dirt with a grader? Does that mean the first time the equipment shows up on your property? But you need to understand what those milestones are. Same thing as commercial operation or commercial generation. You might hear it called COD, the commercial operation date. But understand what that definition is. When we say commercial operation date, does that mean the first day that that project is generating power and putting it to the grid? Because that's something that triggers a different set of payments. Know what those milestones are, and also know how you're going to verify that. It's really hard to look at a solar project and tell when it's generating power. It really doesn't move a lot. So you actually have to have some sort of notification that tells you, hey, we're now generating commercial power. Be very clear on how your land is going to be released from any sorts of encumbrances that are caused by the project. Your project probably comes with some liens, maybe some easements, any sort of thing that might be connected to the title of the land, and make sure you understand how that's going to be released when the project is over. So, for example, you probably want to have a provision in your lease that says, developer, you're not allowed to do anything that will create a lien on this property. And if by chance you do, you need to have some sort of escrow fund or security that makes sure I'll have the ability to release that lien if it's ever put in place on my property to make sure my title remains clean. If you have any easements and you stop using the project, you will go forward into the county records office and release those liens so those don't encumber my title any further after the project's been completed. Make sure you have a means of getting rid of any sort of encumbrance on your property that might be caused by the project after the project's been completed. And then again, always make sure that you have the means to harmonize how you use the surface for agriculture with the development of the property for energy. Most wind leases will include a provision that say the surface owner can still use the land for livestock production, crops, etc., etc. But if your lease doesn't have that, make sure you get that put in there. As again with solar is a lot more intensive use of the property over a smaller area, so you may not have the ability to graze or raise crops in the area, but negotiate, see if you can get that in place. Just make sure that you can reserve the right to use the surface as you've been using it in a way that's consistent with the project.